"You're nothing but a parasite, Mom. You don't deserve a dime of this inheritance." Those words tore through the chapel like glass shattering against stone. My daughter's voice, Isabella's voice, rang in my ears, louder than the organ, louder than the weeping of mourners. For a moment, I thought my knees would give out. Right there by my sister's coffin, I stood still, my hands clasped so tightly the veins swelled beneath my skin. People gasped. Some stared at me with pity, others with judgment, as though they had all been waiting for this theater of shame. And it was my own child who played the lead. I wanted to scream back, to remind her of the nights I stayed up when she had a fever, the mornings I walked miles to work so she could take the bus, the quiet sacrifices no one ever wrote down. But instead, I swallowed the fire rising in my chest. My silence wasn't weakness, it was armor. My lips pressed shut not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood that words at the wrong time can destroy what years of endurance have tried to protect. As the service continued, the smell of lilies and candle wax filled the air, yet I felt only the sting of betrayal. Isabella thought she had silenced me. She was wrong. My silence was not an end, it was the beginning of something stronger. My name is Margaret Wilson, and I am 62 years old. I've spent most of my life in the same small town here in California, surrounded by vineyards and hills that glow gold in the evenings. Folks who know me would probably describe me as a quiet woman. I'm not the type to raise my voice or stir up trouble. For more than 30 years, I worked as an elementary school teacher. The kind of teacher who always carried extra tissues in her pockets and kept a jar of hard candy on the desk for children who had a rough day. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and it mattered to me. I had always thought I would teach until I was close to 70. But life doesn't always follow the plans we lay out. My sister Eleanor became ill, and she needed me. So I boxed up my classroom books, pencils, little drawings the kids had made for me, and I walked away from the chalkboard for good. It was one of the hardest choices I ever made. But I couldn't imagine leaving Eleanor to face her sickness alone. Eleanor was my only sister, my closest companion since childhood. We grew up together in that old farmhouse with peeling white paint, wide front steps, and a screen door that squeaked every time it opened. As little girls, we used to race barefoot across the vineyard rows, our feet stained purple from crushed grapes. Eleanor was always faster, always braver. She climbed trees higher than I dared, and she was the first to speak her mind, even if it got her in trouble. When our parents passed, Eleanor inherited the land. She poured her whole life into it. By the time she fell sick, she owned 250 acres of vineyard, 400 cattle, and that old Cadillac she loved so much. People in town always noticed her when she drove down Main Street. She would sit straight and tall, one hand on the wheel, nodding at neighbors like a queen making her rounds. We were very different, Eleanor and I. She was bold, never afraid to demand what she thought she deserved. I was softer, content to support from the side. But when she got sick, all of that boldness slowly drained from her. There were nights she cried out from pain, and I would sit by her bed, holding her hand until the morning light came through the curtains. I helped her pay bills, handled paperwork, and sometimes just sat in silence with her, because that was all she needed. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because she was my sister. When Eleanor died, she left everything to me. Some people shook their heads in surprise, but I wasn't surprised at all. I had cared for her, lived with her, and helped her keep the vineyard alive. She knew I wouldn't sell it off or waste it. She trusted me to protect what she had built. But my daughter, Isabella, didn't see it that way. Isabella is 35 now. She was my only child, and for years she was the center of my world. I remember her as a little girl, running through the vineyard rows with her hair flying behind her, hands sticky from stealing grapes. She used to say, the cows looked like big, gentle giants, and she would stand by the fence for hours talking to them. For a while, I thought she loved this land as much as I did. But as she grew, she changed. She wanted more than what our small town could offer. She became ambitious, sharp, and restless. 8 years ago, she and her husband came to me, asking for $30,000 to fund a business idea. He painted big dreams, talked about fast growth and success, but I knew the plan was shaky. I knew it wasn't wise. And so, I told her no. That single no cut our bond in half. She looked me in the eye and said I had failed her as a mother. Then she walked away and never came back. For 8 years, we lived separate lives. I heard she was doing well in the city, making money, climbing ladders. I told myself maybe one day she would understand my decision. Maybe one day she would come back, not with anger, but with forgiveness. That hope ended at Eleanor's funeral. She appeared like a storm after years of silence, and instead of offering comfort, she offered only accusations. In front of everyone, she called me a parasite, said I didn't deserve what Eleanor left me. The sting wasn't just from her words, it was from the fact that they came from my own child. I remember standing there, next to my sister's coffin, while neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked at me with pity, some with suspicion, and all of them knew they were witnessing a family tearing itself apart right there in the church. But this wasn't just a story about me and Isabella. Others stood in the background, their lives tied into mine. There was Samuel, the vineyard manager. He had worked for Eleanor for more than 30 years. His hands were calloused from pruning vines and fixing fences, and his voice was as steady as the earth he worked on. When I looked shaken after Isabella's outburst, Samuel placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Don't worry, Mrs. Wilson. I'm not going anywhere." That meant more to me than I can say. There was Maxwell Thornton, Eleanor's lawyer. He was the one who read the will. Maxwell wasn't the warm type. He wore dark suits even on sunny days, and his words were clipped, like every syllable cost money. He didn't care about feelings. He cared about facts, about signatures and legal lines. I respected that about him, even if I never quite trusted the coldness in his eyes. And then there was Ellen Price, my old college friend. Ellen had gone on to become a judge before retiring. She was sharp, blunt, and had no patience for foolishness. When I told her about Isabella's anger, she didn't waste time with pity. She said, "Margaret, you'd better brace yourself. This isn't about grief. This is about greed. Stand tall." She was right, and I knew it. And of course, even in death, there was Eleanor. I felt her everywhere. In the long rows of vines that stretched toward the horizon, in the cattle that grazed under the sun, in the Cadillac that still gleamed in the barn, as though waiting for her to climb inside again. Her presence lingered in every corner of the farmhouse, from the smell of her perfume in the closet to the handwritten notes she left by the kitchen phone. So that was my world after the funeral. A loyal worker at my side, a stern lawyer guiding me through paperwork, a blunt friend pushing me to stay strong, and a daughter standing against me. And over it all, the memory of Eleanor, watching. That evening, when the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the vineyard in shades of orange, I stood on the porch of the farmhouse. The rows stretched out like endless lines of memory, and the cattle's low calls echoed in the distance. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and whispered to myself, the storm's only beginning, because Isabella hadn't come home to mourn. She had come home to claim. The day of the funeral should have been about Eleanor, about laying her to rest with dignity, about remembering the woman who had poured her life into the vineyard. Instead, it turned into a battlefield of words, and the first shot was fired by my own daughter. Isabella stood before me, her voice sharp enough to slice through the hush of the chapel, and she declared that I did not deserve any part of what Eleanor left. Her anger echoed against the stained glass windows, and I felt the eyes of the mourners burn into my back like the midday sun scorching the vines. I did not answer her then. I stood frozen, my hands clasped tight enough to leave little moons on my palms. Some folks shook their heads as if ashamed for me. Others leaned toward each other, whispering behind raised hands, and still others just stared, waiting to see if I would break. I heard Samuel step forward, his boots tapping against the wooden floor, but I raised a hand to stop him. "Let her speak," I whispered, though my throat felt raw. I could not silence my own daughter, even when her words tore me apart. What stung most was not just her accusation, but the memory that lived underneath it. 8 years earlier, Isabella had left me with bitterness in her heart. She had wanted $30,000 for her husband's big idea, a dream that looked shiny on the surface but was built on sand. I had refused, not because I wanted to wound her, but because I wanted to protect her from disappointment. She did not see it that way. She told me I had failed her as a mother, that if I truly loved her, I would have handed her the money without question. That was the last conversation we had before she walked out of my house. Now, here she was again, throwing those same accusations in my face, only louder, only crueler, and with an audience that would carry the tale across town before the day was done. As the service ended, people filed out with lowered eyes. Some touched my arm in pity, others avoided me altogether, and I could feel their judgments hanging in the air. In a town like ours, stories travel faster than wildfire, and I knew by evening everyone would be talking. Not about Eleanor's life, but about Isabella's words. The thought made my stomach twist, but I held my head high. I would not let anyone see me crumble. My silence was my shield, though inside me a storm was gathering. Later that evening, Samuel came by the farmhouse. He stood on the porch, hat in his hands, eyes heavy with concern. "Mrs. Wilson," he said softly, "don't let her words eat at you. Folks know what you did for your sister. They've seen it with their own eyes." His loyalty was a comfort, like steady earth beneath my feet. Still, I could not ignore the wound Isabella had opened. The following week, I received word from Maxwell Thornton, Eleanor's lawyer. He said Isabella had filed a lawsuit to freeze the estate, claiming I had manipulated her aunt into leaving me everything. The words in that letter blurred as I read them, but the meaning was clear. My daughter was dragging me into court. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with the letter trembling in my hands, the scent of Eleanor's favorite lavender soap still clinging to the walls of the house, and thinking how quickly love could turn into warfare. It did not stop there. A few days later, stories began appearing online and in the local paper. They painted me as a greedy woman who had taken advantage of her dying sister. Anonymous comments accused me of isolating Eleanor, of pushing her into signing the will. The words stung like nettles, especially because I knew exactly where they came from. Samuel later confirmed it. He discovered that Isabella's husband's marketing company was behind the smear campaign. They had turned their bitterness into a business weapon. One morning, Isabella herself appeared at the vineyard. She wore a sharp suit and high heels that sank into the soft dirt of the driveway, and in her hands she carried a folder thick with papers. She pushed them toward me without even saying hello. "Sign these," she ordered. "Half the land, half the cattle, half of everything, give it to me, and we can be done with this." Her eyes glittered with anger, but also with desperation. I stared at those papers, the inked lines demanding I surrender my sister's legacy, and I felt a fire rise inside me. Without a word, I took the folder, walked to the fireplace, and dropped it into the flames. The paper curled and blackened, and the crackling fire answered her demand better than my voice ever could. Isabella's face flushed crimson, and she stormed out, the sound of her heels striking the wooden porch like a drumbeat of war. That night I could not sleep. The house groaned in the wind, and every creak felt like Eleanor's spirit moving through the halls, reminding me of the promise I had made to protect what she left behind. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we had shared countless cups of tea, and whispered into the silence, "I will not let her take this from us." It was a vow, spoken not just to my sister, but to myself. The days that followed were heavy. The lawsuit loomed like dark clouds over the vineyard. Workers whispered about whether the land would be sold. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and cautious eyes, offering sympathy wrapped in curiosity. And through it all, I carried the weight of knowing that the fiercest battle of my life would not be against a stranger but against my own child. Yet even as the world seemed to tilt against me, I held on to one truth. Eleanor had trusted me. She had left everything to me, not because I demanded it, but because she knew I would guard it. And though Isabella's words had humiliated me in public, though her actions threatened to break me in private, I understood something that gave me strength. This was only the first strike. The war was far from over, and I was not as weak as my daughter believed. The days after the funeral stretched out, like an endless road covered in dust. Every morning I woke up to the sound of cattle lowing in the fields, the smell of coffee drifting through the kitchen, and yet none of it felt familiar anymore. The land looked the same, but I carried a different weight now, one that pressed against my chest from the moment I opened my eyes. Isabella's voice still rang in my ears, those cruel words spoken in front of everyone. I wanted to tell myself they were just words, but they had set something in motion that could not be undone. Within a week, Maxwell called to tell me that Isabella had officially filed papers to freeze the estate. Hearing the words out loud was like feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. Eleanor's vineyard, the cattle, the house, even the Cadillac. Suddenly, all of it was tied up in legal knots because my daughter believed she had a right to what my sister had trusted me with. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the sunlight falling through the window, feeling like the world outside kept moving while mine had come to a halt. Samuel came by that afternoon, his boots leaving trails of dust on the porch. He didn't need to ask what was wrong, he had already heard. In a small town, nothing stays hidden for long. He stood by the counter, hat in his hands, and said quietly, "Mrs. Wilson, storms come and go, but this land has seen worse. We'll get through this." His words were simple, but they anchored me. Samuel had worked beside Eleanor for decades, and he knew the vineyard as well as anyone. To have him by my side was like having steady roots holding me up. Still, I could not shake the image of Isabella standing in court, her sharp eyes turned against me. Not long after the lawsuit came another blow. Stories began appearing online, shared on blogs, and even picked up by a local news site. They claimed that I had manipulated Eleanor, that I had taken advantage of her weakness to steal her estate. There were ugly words like greedy and parasite, words that had already left my daughter's lips, but now were written in bold letters for strangers to read. Some articles even suggested that I had isolated Eleanor from friends, forcing her to leave everything to me. At first I thought it was gossip running wild, but Samuel dug deeper and found the truth. The campaign was coming straight from Isabella's husband's marketing company. The realization hit me like cold water. My own daughter and her husband were not just angry. They were willing to destroy my name to get what they wanted. The smear campaign spread quickly. Neighbors who used to wave now avoided eye contact. At the grocery store, I felt whispers ripple behind me. Even at church, where people are supposed to find grace, I caught sight of two women leaning close, shaking their heads as I passed. It was as if years of sacrifice, of teaching children, of caring for my sister, had been erased by a single story told loudly enough. I found myself walking with my shoulders hunched, not because I was guilty, but because shame has a way of clinging even when you have nothing to be ashamed of. One morning, Isabella arrived at the vineyard. I saw her car, shiny and sleek, pulling up the gravel driveway that Eleanor's old Cadillac used to roll across. She stepped out in heels that sank into the dirt, her hair perfect, her face set in hard lines. She walked straight up to me, carrying a folder thick with papers. Without greeting me, she shoved it into my hands. "Sign these," she demanded. "Half the land, half the cattle, half of everything. Give me what's mine, and this can end." I opened the folder and saw contracts already filled in, the lines waiting only for my signature. My chest tightened as I thought of Eleanor, of the promise I had made her when she was too weak to speak clearly, of the way she had whispered, "Keep it safe, Margaret." I felt heat rise in me, not the heat of anger alone, but of fierce protection. Without saying a word, I carried the folder into the living room, walked to the fireplace, and dropped it into the flames. The papers curled and blackened as the fire swallowed them, the crackling wood giving the only answer Isabella deserved. She gasped, her face turning red with fury, and then she stormed out, her heels pounding against the porch like angry drumbeats. That night, the farmhouse was too quiet. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, the fire still smoldering in the hearth. I imagined Eleanor sitting across from me, her eyes sharp but kind, and I whispered into the silence, "I will not let her destroy this. I promise you." The wind rattled the windows as if the house itself was answering me, reminding me that it had stood through storms before and would stand through this one too. But the attacks did not stop. More stories appeared online. More rumors spread in town. At one point, a blog post even accused me of neglecting Eleanor during her illness, of letting her suffer while I schemed to get her assets. Reading those lies made me tremble with rage. I wanted to scream the truth, to shout it from the rooftops, but instead I held on to silence, because I knew reacting with fury would only feed their fire. Still, the weight of it all pressed on me, heavy as a sack of stones on my back. Then came another twist. Ellen Price, my old college friend who had retired from the bench, called me one evening. Her voice was calm but firm. "Margaret," she said, "I've been following what's happening. You need to be ready, because this isn't just a tantrum. Your daughter and her husband have a plan, and you can't fight it by staying quiet forever." Her words sat with me long after we hung up. I had always believed silence was strength, but Ellen was right. Sometimes silence needs to end so the truth can be heard. The first wave of Isabella's war had begun. The lawsuit, the media attacks, the papers she tried to force into my hands. Each blow was heavier than the last. Each one meant to break me, but instead of falling apart, I felt something harden inside me. My daughter did not just want the land. She wanted to erase me, to paint me as nothing but a shadow in Eleanor's story. And I knew I could not let her. After that night when Ellen called me, I began to see everything more clearly. It was no longer just about harsh words at a funeral or papers shoved into my hands. This was a battle that had spread into every corner of my life, twisting the way neighbors looked at me, shaking the trust of workers who had been with our family for decades, even creeping into the quiet moments when I was alone in the farmhouse. Silence had carried me through so many trials before, but now it felt like a thin blanket against a storm that showed no signs of passing. I knew I had to prepare for more than whispers and lawsuits, because Isabella was determined not only to take what belonged to Eleanor, but also to tear down the woman her aunt had trusted most. Not long after, I found myself sitting across from Maxwell in his office. The place smelled of polished wood and old paper, the shelves lined with books that looked untouched for years. He sat stiffly behind his desk, glasses perched on the end of his nose, his hands folded together. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, "your daughter's case is weak, but she has filed motions that can tie this estate up for months, maybe even years. They are trying to drain you, both emotionally and financially." His words struck me like cold water. Months, maybe years, that was the future he laid out for me. A future where the vineyard would sit frozen in legal disputes, where I would spend more time in courtrooms than in the fields Eleanor had loved. I nodded, though inside me a tremor ran through my chest. When I left his office, I walked down Main Street, the same street Eleanor used to drive her Cadillac through, with her head held high. Now, as I passed shop windows and familiar faces, I felt the weight of eyes on me. Some offered polite smiles, others turned away, and a few simply stared with judgment. It felt like carrying an invisible scarlet letter, one I had not earned, but was forced to wear nonetheless. The town that once felt like home now felt like a stage where every glance was another verdict passed against me. As weeks went by, Isabella's campaign grew sharper. More articles surfaced, each one painting me as a manipulator, each one erasing Eleanor's voice as if she had never made her own choices. Samuel brought me one of the papers one morning, the headlines screaming about greed and betrayal. He tossed it onto the kitchen table, his jaw tight. "This is poison," he muttered. I looked at the bold black letters, the kind that strangers would read and believe because it was easier than digging for truth, and I felt the ache of betrayal deepen. My daughter was not just reaching for land and cattle, she was cutting away at my dignity piece by piece. Then one evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the vineyard in colors of fire, Isabella returned. She did not come quietly, she came with cameras. A reporter followed her up the driveway, microphone in hand, asking questions I refused to answer. Isabella stood tall, her smile sharp as glass, and spoke of justice and truth, as though she were some heroine protecting her aunt's legacy. I stood behind the porch rail, my fingers gripping the wood until my knuckles turned white, and I let her talk. Inside, my heart burned, but outside I held steady. I would not give them the spectacle they wanted. Later that night, when the vineyard was quiet again, I sat with Ellen in the farmhouse kitchen. She had driven down to see me, her bluntness cutting through the haze that clouded my mind. "Margaret," she said, "you cannot keep letting her shape the story. Right now, the town believes her because she's the loudest voice. But you and I both know Eleanor trusted you. You have to show people why. You have to let them see the truth with their own eyes." I stared into my cup of tea, steam curling upward like smoke from a fire that refused to die. And I knew she was right. Eleanor's words came back to me then, from one of our last conversations. Her voice had been weak, but her eyes had been steady. "I'm leaving it all to you, Margaret," she had whispered. "Not because you asked, but because you'll never sell it. Promise me you'll keep it safe." That memory wrapped around me like a cloak, reminding me of the vow I had made. Isabella might twist stories. She might drag me through courts and headlines. But she could not rewrite the truth that lived in Eleanor's own voice. The next morning, I walked the rows of the vineyard. The sun was warm on my back, the soil firm beneath my shoes, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a steadiness return to me. Each vine was a reminder of Eleanor's hands, her labor, her dreams. Each cow grazing in the distance was part of her legacy. I realized then that I was not just defending land. I was defending memory, history, and the bond between sisters that no smear campaign could erase. From that moment on, I decided I would not simply endure Isabella's attacks in silence. I would gather the truth, piece by piece, and when the time came, I would let the world see it. Because the battle was no longer about inheritance, it was about erasure. And I would not let my daughter erase me, nor the sister who had trusted me until her very last breath. The storm had risen higher than I had imagined, and the sky above me looked darker with every passing day. But my roots were deep. I would not be moved. The weeks that followed were heavy with silence and noise all at once. Outside, the vineyard moved through its rhythm, as it always had, the cattle grazing in the fields, the vines stretching upward under the California sun, the farmhouse creaking as the wind pushed against its old wooden bones. But inside me, everything felt unsettled. Every knock at the door, every letter slipped into the mailbox, every whisper I caught in town carried the weight of Isabella's war. I lived with the knowledge that my own daughter was fighting me, not with quiet disagreements or private arguments, but with lawsuits, headlines, and lies broadcast to anyone willing to listen. Ellen kept reminding me that staying silent forever would only let Isabella's version of the story grow louder. She said, "Margaret, people are listening, but right now they only hear her. You have to give them something true to hold on to." I thought about her words often, especially in the long nights when the house was too quiet and Eleanor's absence pressed on me like a stone. I had always believed that dignity came from restraint, that silence was strength. But now I realized silence could also be a prison, locking away the truth while lies ran free outside its bars. One afternoon, Ellen drove down to the farmhouse carrying a box of files. She set it on the kitchen table with a thud that made the dishes rattle. "These," she said, "are things you need to see." Inside the box were printed emails, letters, and contracts that made my stomach twist as I read them. They showed correspondence between Isabella and developers from Nevada, men who were planning luxury resorts and casinos. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, had been negotiating to sell the vineyard, the cattle, even the farmhouse itself, to strangers who saw nothing but dollar signs in the land that Eleanor had devoted her life to. I sat back in my chair, the papers trembling in my hands. "She was going to sell everything," I whispered. Ellen nodded, her expression firm. "Yes, and she would have done it too, if Eleanor had left it to her. That's why she's fighting you so hard. This isn't about memory, Margaret. It's about profit." The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. I thought Isabella wanted the land out of some twisted sense of entitlement, or maybe because she believed I had wronged her years ago. But now I saw clearly. She did not care about Eleanor's legacy, about the soil under our feet, about the cattle that grazed lazily in the sun. She saw it only as a bank to be broken open, a prize to be cashed in. The truth burned in me, sharper than any wound. That evening, I went through Eleanor's things again. In a drawer by her bedside, tucked beneath a stack of old letters, I found a small recorder. My hands shook as I pressed the button, and then her voice filled the room. Weak but steady, Eleanor spoke. "I'm leaving everything to Margaret, not because she asked, but because she will never sell it. She understands what this place means. It is memory, it is blood, it is our family. She will keep it safe." Hearing her voice, even through the scratchy recording, brought tears to my eyes. It was as though she was still there, still guiding me. And in that moment, I knew Ellen was right. It was time to stop hiding behind silence. The next morning, I called Ellen. "We need to show this," I told her. She agreed, and together we began to plan. If Isabella wanted to spread her lies in public, then I would spread the truth in the same way. Not out of spite, but out of duty to Eleanor, to myself, and even to the daughter who had lost her way. We arranged for a town hall meeting. Samuel helped spread the word quietly among the workers and neighbors, and Ellen contacted a journalist named Clara, who had a reputation for digging into the truth no matter where it led. At first, I was terrified. The thought of standing before the entire town, bearing my wounds and speaking of the betrayal, made me feel like a child about to step onto a stage. But then I thought of Eleanor, of her voice in that recording, of her trust in me. Fear became smaller than my responsibility to her. On the evening of the meeting, the town hall filled quickly. Wooden chairs scraped against the floor, and people whispered as they settled in. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me as I sat near the front, Ellen on one side, Samuel on the other. The air buzzed with curiosity and tension. When the doors opened again, Isabella walked in late, as if to command attention. She wore a confident smile that made my stomach clench, the kind of smile that said she believed she had already won. Clara, the journalist, stood and addressed the crowd. She explained that there had been much said in whispers and online, but tonight there would be evidence. She began with the emails, projecting them onto a screen so that every person in the room could see. Words lit up in front of us, Isabella's words to the developers, promising them acres of vineyard and deals worth millions. Gasps filled the room, neighbors whispering to one another, the weight of realization spreading like ripples on water. Then Clara played the recording. Eleanor's voice filled the hall, fragile but clear. "I'm leaving everything to Margaret, not because she asked, but because she will never sell it." Silence followed, a silence so deep I could hear my own breath echoing inside me. I looked at the faces in the crowd, people who had doubted me, judged me, whispered behind my back, and I saw their expressions change. Doubt turned to understanding, judgment turned to shame, whispers turned to nods of respect. Slowly, I stood. My legs felt heavy, but my voice came steady. I looked at Isabella, who sat stiff in her chair, her smile gone, her eyes burning. "You came here for money," I said, my voice carrying across the room. "But I stayed for memory. This land is not just property. It is the story of my sister, the years she gave, the love she poured into every vine and every field. I will not sell it, and I will not let anyone else sell it, no matter who they are." The room erupted, not in anger, but in support. People clapped, some even stood, and I felt a swell of strength inside me that I had not known in years. Samuel squeezed my hand. Ellen gave me a proud nod, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt the weight on my chest lift. Isabella stood abruptly, her face red with rage, and stormed out of the hall without a word. But even as the crowd cheered, even as people finally saw the truth, I knew in my heart that the fight was not over. Isabella's pride would not let her walk away so easily. She had already invested too much anger, too much bitterness, to let go. The evidence had struck her hard, but I could see it in her eyes as she left. She was not done yet. That night, when the farmhouse was quiet again, I sat by the fireplace, listening to the crackle of burning wood. The victory felt real, but it also felt fragile, like glass that could shatter with one wrong touch. I whispered into the flames, "Eleanor, I hope I made you proud." And though the house gave no answer, I felt her presence around me, steady as the land itself, reminding me that this was only the turning point, not the end. The night after the town hall meeting, I barely slept. Even though the crowd had clapped for me, even though the truth of Eleanor's voice had filled that hall, I knew in my bones that Isabella was not finished. My daughter had always been stubborn, the kind of child who would argue for hours about the smallest thing, who would rather stand in the rain than admit she was wrong. Now she was grown, sharper and harder. But that same stubbornness had only grown with her. As I lay in the dark farmhouse, listening to the wind push against the windows, I felt it deep inside me. Another storm was on the way. The next week, Maxwell called me back to his office. His words were measured, his face as stiff as the collar of his suit. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, "your daughter has demanded a formal hearing at the courthouse. She intends to challenge the will on grounds of undue influence." I knew enough to understand what that meant. Isabella was claiming that I had manipulated Eleanor, that I had pushed her into leaving me everything. The thought alone made me sick. I had spent years taking care of my sister, watching her fade, holding her hand through nights when pain made her cry. To have that love turned into a weapon against me, it was a cruelty I could hardly bear. When I left Maxwell's office, I walked slowly down the courthouse steps, the afternoon sun hot against my back. I could already imagine the whispers that would spread through town. Margaret Wilson, dragged into court by her own daughter. For some, it would be entertainment. For others, proof of the lies they already believed. But for me, it was a wound, cut deep and raw. Ellen met me that evening at the farmhouse. She brought a stack of documents and her usual bluntness. "Margaret," she said, "I've seen cases like this before. They get ugly, but you have to stay steady. You have evidence. You have Samuel. You have Eleanor's voice on that recording. The truth is on your side, but you have to show it, not just hold it." I nodded, though fear pressed on me like heavy stones. The idea of standing in a courtroom, of having my love for Eleanor dissected and questioned, felt unbearable. But I also knew there was no choice. If I stayed quiet, Isabella's lies would grow. If I stood up, at least I could fight with truth in my hands. The day of the hearing arrived. The courthouse smelled of polish and old wood. the kind of place where every sound echoed too loud. I walked in with Samuel beside me, Ellen just behind, and Maxwell carrying files like a soldier with his weapons. The benches were filled with townsfolk, faces familiar and unfamiliar, some curious, some judgmental, some simply hungry for drama. And then Isabella entered. She wore a bright red dress, sharp heels clicking against the marble floor, her chin lifted high. She looked more like a performer stepping onto a stage than a daughter walking into court. When the proceedings began, her lawyer painted me as a manipulative sister, a woman who had taken advantage of Eleanor's weakness. The words rolled out smooth and practiced, but each one felt like a knife to my chest. I wanted to stand and shout, to tell the judge about the nights I had stayed awake by Eleanor's bed, about the meals I had cooked when she was too weak to eat, about the laughter we had shared in those rare good days. But instead, I sat still, waiting for my turn, my fingers curled tightly together. Then it was Maxwell's time. His voice was calm, steady, and he laid out the facts. Eleanor's will had been prepared years before, her signatures matched, her doctors had confirmed her mental clarity. Piece by piece, he built the wall of truth brick by brick. And then came the recording. Eleanor's voice filled the courtroom, just as it had filled the town hall. "I'm leaving everything to Margaret, not because she asked, but because she will never sell it." The room fell silent. Even the judge leaned forward, listening closely. For a moment, I felt Eleanor's presence wash over me, strong and certain. Isabella's face flushed with anger, but she did not back down. She stood, her own voice sharp, and declared, "That doesn't change the fact that my mother never deserved it. She was a failure to me, and she should not profit from my aunt's work." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. I felt the sting of her words cut deep, sharper than any lawyer's accusation. For a heartbeat, I wanted to shrink, to disappear. But then something inside me shifted. I stood slowly, my knees trembling but my voice steady when I spoke. "Judge," I said, "I have been called many names in the past months. Greedy, manipulative, parasite. But I was also called sister. I was called caretaker. I was the one who stayed. My daughter left me years ago because I would not give her money for a business I knew would fail. That was her choice. But Eleanor's choice was her own. She trusted me to protect this land, not to sell it, not to profit from it, but to keep it safe. That is what I will do, whether people believe me or not." The judge nodded, his face unreadable. But I saw something shift in the room. Some people lowered their eyes in shame. Others leaned forward as if hearing my voice for the first time. Isabella sat stiff, her fists clenched, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had wanted to break me, but instead I had found a strength I did not know I carried. When the session ended, the judge announced that a decision would take time. But as I walked out of that courtroom, the sun bright on my face, I felt something inside me settle. The war was not over, but I had stood my ground. And in doing so, I had kept my promise to Eleanor, if only for another day. The night after that first court hearing, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the fire burning low in the hearth, and thought about how far things had gone. My own daughter had stood in front of a judge and called me a failure, not just as a mother but as a human being. The words replayed in my mind like a song I could not turn off. I stirred my tea until it went cold, staring at the steam curl and fade into the air. Silence wrapped around the house, but it was not comforting anymore. It felt like a reminder of the empty space Eleanor had left behind, and of the distance that now stretched between me and the daughter I once cradled in my arms. A few days later, Ellen came back to the farmhouse. She sat down across from me and leaned forward, her eyes sharp the way they had always been. "Margaret," she said, "you can't keep reacting to Isabella. You need to take control. This fight isn't only in the courtroom. It's in the eyes of the town, in the stories being told. If you let her define you, then even if you win the case, you'll lose everything else." Her words struck me hard. She was right. Isabella's campaign had already painted me as a villain, and the town had eaten it up like gossip over morning coffee. I could not just wait for the judge's gavel to clear my name. I had to step into the light myself. So we decided to call another gathering, this time at the vineyard. Samuel helped arrange it. Workers set up chairs near the barn. Clara, the journalist, agreed to come again, and Ellen stood by me every step of the way. I was nervous, my stomach twisting as I prepared. But I reminded myself of Eleanor's recording, of her voice steady even in her final days, and I knew I could not falter now. When the evening came, the vineyard glowed under the setting sun. Neighbors, workers, and townsfolk gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity and doubt. Isabella arrived late once again, dressed sharply, her heels clattering on the wooden boards, as if to announce her presence before she even spoke. She looked at me with that same fire in her eyes, the fire that had once fueled her ambition and now fueled her rage. Clara began by showing more evidence. The full contracts between Isabella and the developers, the timelines, the signatures that made clear her intent to sell everything. Murmurs spread through the crowd as people saw the truth for themselves. Then Clara turned to me. "Mrs. Wilson," she said, "do you have anything you want to share?" I took a deep breath and stepped forward. My hands trembled, but my voice was steady. This land is not just soil and fences. It is the story of a family. My parents planted vines here. My sister grew them into something beautiful, and I stood by her when she was too weak to stand alone. Eleanor left it to me, not because I asked, not because I begged, but because she trusted me to protect it. And I will. I paused, looking at Isabella, her face hard as stone. I know what people have heard about me. That I'm greedy, that I'm a parasite, that I took advantage of my sister. But the truth is simple. I stayed. I cared. And I will not sell what she worked her whole life to build. The crowd grew quiet. Some nodded, some wiped at their eyes. And I could feel the tide turning, but Isabella wasn't ready to surrender. She stepped forward, her voice raised, her anger sharp enough to cut through the air. "You don't deserve it," she shouted. "You never deserved any of it. You're just hiding behind a dead woman's words. This vineyard should have been mine, and everyone here knows it." Her words hung heavy, but before I could answer, Samuel spoke. His deep voice carried across the gathering. "Miss Isabella," he said firmly, "I worked beside your aunt for over 30 years. I saw who cared for her, who showed up, who sacrificed. It wasn't you, it was your mother. She was here every day. She gave her time, her strength, and her love. This vineyard was never yours to claim." His words struck the crowd like a hammer. People turned to look at Isabella, and for the first time, I saw her falter. I stepped closer to her then, lowering my voice so only those nearest could hear. But the words carried all the same. "You think this is about money, Isabella, but it's about memory. And memory cannot be bought, sold, or signed away. You left when you wanted money from me. You abandoned me when I said no. That was your choice. But Eleanor's choice was her own. She gave this to me because she trusted I would never betray it, and I won't." For a moment, the air was still. Isabella's face reddened. Her lips trembled. And then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed away. The sound of her heels on the boards echoed long after she was gone, like thunder rolling away after a storm. The crowd erupted in applause. People stood, clapping, some even calling my name, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. For the first time since Eleanor's passing, I no longer felt like I was carrying the burden alone. The truth had spoken louder than the lies, and the people had finally seen it. That night, as I stood on the porch of the farmhouse, the vineyard glowing under the moonlight, I whispered to the wind, "We did it, Eleanor." But deep in my heart, I knew the story wasn't finished. Isabella had walked away, but I could feel it, her anger had not cooled. This battle had not reached its final chapter. After that night at the vineyard, when the truth finally came out before the town, I felt a weight lift from my chest, but I also knew it was not the end. Isabella's pride was too fierce, her anger too sharp to let her walk away quietly. And sure enough, she tried once more to claw her way back into the fight. She filed more motions through her lawyer, trying to delay, trying to keep the inheritance frozen, hoping I would grow tired, give up, or break down. But by then, something inside me had changed. I was no longer the woman standing in silence at a funeral, swallowing fire with my lips pressed tight. I had spoken, I had stood, and I had felt the crowd rise around me like a shield. I was no longer afraid of her fury. The court battle dragged on for weeks. Each time I walked into that wooden building, I carried Eleanor's words with me. Each time Isabella's lawyer raised his voice to call me manipulative or greedy, I heard Samuel's steady tone in my memory, reminding the world of who had truly stayed. And each time Isabella glared at me from across the courtroom, I held my head high, remembering the promise I had made to Eleanor. Keep it safe. It was not easy. The lies still hurt. The looks from neighbors who had once trusted me still stung. But truth, once it takes root, begins to grow in ways even lies cannot strangle. Finally, the judge delivered his ruling. He confirmed that Eleanor's will was valid, that her choice was her own, and that I was the rightful heir to her land, her cattle, her home, and her memories. Isabella lost her case. I sat in that courtroom with Ellen at my side, Samuel just behind me, and felt tears prick at my eyes. It was not the tears of defeat, but the quiet release of years of weight, of months of attacks. I had been called names, dragged through mud, and struck down in public, but I had not fallen. I had stood, and the truth had stood with me. Isabella left the courtroom that day with her head high but her face pale. Her reputation had crumbled under the evidence of her greed, and the town that once leaned toward her stories now turned away. For a while, she kept fighting in smaller ways. Letters, complaints, rumors, but each attempt grew weaker, like the last sparks of a fire burning itself out. Eventually, even she seemed to realize that the battle was over. With the estate finally free, I turned my attention back to the vineyard. There was work to be done, vines to be tended, cattle to be cared for. Samuel stood by me, as he always had, his steady presence like an anchor in the storm. Together, we began to rebuild not only the vineyard's rhythm, but also the faith of the workers who had worried about the land's future. Slowly, laughter returned to the fields. Slowly, I could walk through town with my shoulders straight again, knowing the truth had been seen. But even in victory, I did not want to live only for myself. Eleanor had spent her life building something larger than her own comfort, and I wanted to honor that. So, I started a foundation in her name, a place to help women over 50 who had been betrayed, abandoned, or left behind. I wanted them to have a chance to rebuild, to find steady ground again, just as I had found mine. The first meeting of the foundation was held right there in the farmhouse kitchen, with a small group of women sitting around the table where Eleanor and I had once shared tea. Their stories were different from mine, yet familiar in the weight they carried. And as I listened, I realized that the pain I had endured had been turned into something larger, something that could heal not only me, but others too. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new kind of peace. The vineyard thrived again. The cattle grazed in the fields as though they had never known turmoil, and the Cadillac gleamed in the barn like a memory preserved. But one evening, as the sun was setting in streaks of gold across the land, I saw a figure standing by the fence. My heart knew before my eyes did. It was Isabella. She looked different. Her clothes were still sharp, but her shoulders slumped, her eyes tired. She walked toward me slowly, each step heavy. When she finally reached the porch where I stood, she did not shout. She did not sneer. She simply looked at me, her face pale in the fading light, and said, "I have nothing left." For a moment, I could not speak. Memories of her words at the funeral, Her accusations in court, the smear campaigns, the betrayal, all of it flooded me. But then I saw her as she was in that moment, not as the enemy who had tried to destroy me, but as the daughter I had once held close, the little girl who had run through vineyard rows with grape juice on her hands. I swallowed hard, and I answered quietly, "You are still my daughter." But love without respect is only a wound that never heals. She looked at me, tears gathering in her eyes, and then she turned and walked away into the twilight. I do not know if she will ever come back. I do not know if forgiveness will ever bloom fully between us. But I do know that I no longer carry hate in my heart. What I carry now is responsibility to protect what Eleanor trusted me with, to honor her memory, and to use the pain I endured to help others find strength in their own storms. The vineyard stands tall again, its vines reaching toward the sky, its cattle grazing peacefully. The farmhouse breathes with history, its walls holding laughter and sorrow alike. And I stand in the middle of it all. No longer just a woman accused, no longer just a mother betrayed, but a sister, a survivor, and a keeper of memory. Sometimes, when the evening light falls soft across the land, I whisper into the wind, "We did it, Eleanor." And though she is gone, I feel her near, as steady as the earth beneath my feet. Looking back on everything that happened, the funeral, the courtroom battles, the smear campaigns, the shouting, the tears, I realize that the deepest wounds do not always come from strangers. They often come from the ones we love the most, the ones we would give anything to protect. My daughter's words cut me sharper than any lawyer's accusations, sharper than any gossip whispered in town. Yet through that pain, I discovered a strength I never knew I carried. Motherhood is not endless sacrifice. It is not giving until there is nothing left of yourself. True love must also come with respect, because love without respect is not love at all. It is a wound that never heals. For years, I believed silence was my shield, and sometimes it was. But I also learned that silence can become a prison. There comes a time when a mother, a sister, a woman must raise her voice, not out of anger, but out of truth. I chose to speak when it mattered most, and in doing so, I protected not only Eleanor's vineyard, but also her memory. I protected my own dignity as a mother, even when my own child tried to strip it away. And though Isabella may never fully return to me, though forgiveness may be a road longer than I can see, I carry no hate in my heart, only responsibility to keep what was entrusted to me safe, and to use my story to help others who have faced betrayal and loss. So, if you are listening, if you are sitting with a broken heart, if you have been called names or abandoned by someone you love, remember this: your silence is not weakness. It is the space where truth gathers its strength. And when the time comes, your voice steady, calm, and honest will carry farther than all the lies spoken against you. This is not just my story. It is the story of many mothers, many sisters, many women who have endured pain but found the courage to rise again. If it touched your heart, I ask you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to this channel, not just to hear my voice, but to hear the voices of mothers everywhere who stood in the storm and did not fall. Together, we remind the world that memory, respect, and love are worth more than any inheritance ever could be.